All right, hello everyone. No. There we go. Yeah. Okay. A middle-aged heroine finding liberation through Satan, combined with a pronounced feminist critique of Christianity as a pillar of patriarchy. Could this be the stuff of a bestseller in 1926? Apparently, yes, as this is what Sylvia Townsend Warner's 1926 novel Lolly Willowes, or The Loving Huntsman, is all about. It not only sold well, but was very well received critically, even if, as we will see, not everyone seems to have quite grasped its full implications. Growing up with a father who was a history teacher and a housemaster at Harrow, Warner was privately tutored and showed impressive intellectual abilities from an early age. Lolly Willowes was her debut novel, and it is a humorous tale set in 1922. Written in a simple, accessible way, the text could be described as naturalistic and matter-of-fact, but seasoned with much wit, irony, and satire. It begins by treating everyday happenings in a low-key manner and ends in a near-seamless amalgamation of the realistic and the fantastic. The protagonist, Lolly Willowes, gradually comes to the insight that a number of societal structures are hindering women from living their lives in freedom. These structures include church and family. When Lolly has reached middle age and with some effort has resisted her family's attempts to marry her off, she makes the drastic decision to move from London to an isolated village in the countryside. Finding great joy in her new semi-solitary rural existence, she comes to understand her family have been tyrants, unjustly lording over her and forcing her to perform various female tasks. She establishes the guilt ultimately lies with grander oppressive structures, of which the church and the Bible are key elements. Earlier, she has observed that when her family goes to church on Sundays, quote, they were wound up for the week in much the same manner as the clock her brother winds up every Sunday morning, unquote. Christianity, then, keeps people in line and affects a mechanical conformity. It is, according to the novel, an ideology that fixes women in a position of no agency, and where everyone, women themselves included, feel this is the natural and desirable state of things. Laura's idyllic independent village life is soon threatened by the arrival of her young nephew Titus, who wants her to take care of him in various ways. Now the narrative takes an unexpected turn with the appearance of Satan, who helps her become emancipated through a new identity as a witch. This, however, does not entail submission to Satan, nor has it anything to do with evil. Satan is portrayed as an asexual, mild-mannered god of the forest, whose domain, nature, is contrasted with male-dominated urban civilization. Laura's rejection of traditional notions of what it means to be a witch can be tied to her overarching goal of creating a life not governed by social mores. Rejecting the received idea about Satan as a libidinous evil monster, which was constructed in a patriarchal Christian context, is part of the same project. Laura ponders the role Satan has played for her. Quote, it had pleased Satan to come to her aid. Considering carefully, she did not see who else would have done so. Custom, public opinion, law, church, and state, all would have shaken their massive heads against her plea and sent her back to bondage. Unquote. Laura also reflects on why women become witches. One doesn't become a witch to run round being harmful, or to run round being helpful either, a district visitor on a broomstick. It's to escape all that, to have a life of one's own, not an existence doled out to you by others. Civilization, at least in its modern form, is presented in the novel as intrinsically bound up with a patriarchal power structure. The devil, as a symbol of nature, emerges as the adversary of the masculine social order that God and the Church are part of, and is hence feminized. If God is a pillar of the masculine social order, it is fully cogent to present Satan as an ally of both woman, who is stereotypically supposed to be closer to nature, and of those wishing to rebel against social norms. Satan as a benevolent god of nature was additionally a well-known literary trope. We encounter him, for example, in Nobel Prize winner Giorgio Carducci's Inno a Satana of 1865, and the conflation of Satan with the Greek god Pan, perceived as a god of nature, which was very frequent in literature as well as esotericism at the time, is another example of how strong this association is. The notion of a feminized Satan was similarly prevalent in various turn-of-the-century discourses, but the idea itself was considerably older, with a transgendered Satan with drooping breasts figuring in many Christian depictions, for instance in 12th century church frescoes and in 15th century tarot decks. In literature, Jacques Cassotte's female Lucifer in the 1772 novel Le Diable Amoureux is probably the prime example. During the following century, we have Eliphas Levi and his hermaphrodite Baphomet, whom he sees as a form of Satan. And we have theosophist Gerald Massey's poem Lady Lucifer, and so on. And I should probably have added another slide of visual representations of Satan in turn-of-the-century art with artists like Fidus and Antoine Wiertz and many others who also portrayed a sort of feminized Satan. Though the hints are more subtle in Lolly Willowes, it could be argued the very presence in European culture of such notions regarding the devil's gender in themselves shift the figure in Warner's novel away from the purely masculine. As for the idea of Satan as a liberator, it is in complete unison with theosophical chief ideologist Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's Gnostically tinged chapters on Satan in her 1888 magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine. Blavatsky there emphasizes how Satan, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, set mankind free and is our friend. These pro-Satanic chapters subsequently became an important influence on several early feminists across the world who wished to rehabilitate Eve and make her a heroine rather than a sinner or a victim. One example of this is the exegetic and revisionist 1890s book The Woman's Bible that was produced by an international group of theosophically inspired suffrage activists. Satan the Liberator also appears in works by romantics like Blake, Shelley and Byron, of course. And this literary tradition was very much alive in Warner's own time, for example in Aleister Crowley's poem Hymn to Lucifer from 1920, and the Satanist poems D.H. Lawrence wrote a couple of years after Lolly Willowes. Another example is Anatole France and his 1914 novel La Révolte des Anges. Regarding France's novel, it is interesting to note that Satan there, just like in Lolly Willowes, propagates a sort of individualistic inner resistance instead of external revolution. As a well-educated Englishwoman, we can safely assume Warner was acquainted with the Satanic writings of the Romantics. It is also worth noting that between 1918 and 1920, Warner set poems by Walt Whitman to music. And the American poet had portrayed Satan as a sort of freedom fighter in his famous Chanting the Square Deific, to mention but one of a vast number of examples of literary Satanism that Warner had likely come across. Another intertext that may be important is the socialist use of Satan as a symbol of freedom and justified rebellion, which Warner might have been aware of. She became a member of the British Communist Party only in 1935, but some familiarity with such texts at an earlier date seems reasonable, as she was composing poems about Rosa Luxemburg already in 1924. Before or during the writing of Lolly Willowes, she could well have read the positive references to Satan by socialists like Proudhon, Bakunin, or the American anarchists who named their newspaper Lucifer. All these intertexts must also be considered important for how at least a portion of her readers likely understood Lolly Willowes. This novel, after all, conformed to the conventions of a vaguely outlined tradition of what I, in my book of the same name, have called Satanic feminism, that many would have been familiar with to some degree. This tradition encompasses Percy Shelley's linking of Lucifer and women's liberation in his poem The Revolt of Islam, the Anglo-American homosexual poetess Renée Vivian's paeans to Satan as the god of femininity and lesbianism, Theosophical feminists' use of the Blavatskian counter-reading of Genesis 3 as a tool for suffrage agitation, the benevolent Socratic Satan of the Woman's Bible, and so on. One of Warner's self-admitted sources for Lolly Willowes was Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe. Margaret Murray was a respected Egyptologist, though she in fact lacked formal academic training. Herein we may perhaps partly find the explanation for her somewhat unsound methodology when tackling a completely different field, that of European early modern witchcraft trials. This reorientation in her research was brought about by the temporary suspension of Egyptology during World War I. Her wild ideas, first presented in the journal Folklore in 1917, and subsequently in a best-selling book published by Oxford University Press, were immediately torn to pieces by historians. Nonetheless, they proved to have immense popular appeal and later informed Gerald Gardner's new religion, Wicca. The alleged Satanism of the witch cult was, Murray explained, a misunderstanding, and the horned god witches worshipped was a pagan entity. Now, Satanism or no Satanism, witches were still up to some very wicked things, according to Murray, such as occasionally sacrificing children and desecrating the graves of infants in order to eat their flesh. Whereas earlier influential and equally fanciful accounts of witchcraft by scholars, like French historian Jules Michelet's La Sorcière, had sometimes posited ultimately political incentives for this secretive sect of witches, this was absent in the witch cult. If the witches were proto-socialist freedom fighters to Jules Michelet, they were primarily peasants with peasants' concerns about crops and livestock to Murray. Warner had read Murray's book when it appeared and sent her a copy of her own debut novel shortly after its publication. Soon afterward, they met for lunch, and Warner attested to the Egyptologist's charisma in a letter. Quote, "I wish I were in her coven. Perhaps I shall be." End quote. Margaret Murray liked Warner's portrayal of the witch, but was unsurprisingly more hesitant towards her positive portrayal of the devil. While there are similarities in the stressing of the witch's deity as a god of nature, the continuity with romantic Satanism still seems considerably more important. This applies especially since the motif of Satan as a liberator, the central one here, is not even present in Murray's book. There are also several other prominent deviations from Murray's views, for example in Laura's asexual relation to the devil, which is quite unlike the sexual fertility rites Murray posited as the core of the witch cult. In relation to the social movements of its period, Lolly Willowes can be read as an expression of time-specific feminist issues. After women above the age of 30 had gotten the right to vote in England in 1918, many upper-class feminists had shifted their attention from political representation to self-realization. Virginia Woolf's 1929 A Room of One's Own could be counted as a literary example of this tendency. A more pessimistic view of Lolly Willowes has also been suggested. holding it up as a type of female fantastic fiction where one retreats in disappointment from realistic fiction and the political sphere after having realized how little was actually changed by the 1918 limited franchise reform. It is true that Warner's novel provides little in the way of realistic or collectivistic solutions, instead focusing solely on how Laura as an individual, with supernatural help, can withdraw from a society built on males oppressing females. At the same time, it is clear that Warner's analysis of society emphasizes structures, not individuals. Her feminist narrative may express its critique of patriarchy through a tale with an individualistic resolution, but she still lays bare collective structural issues. If this reflects an enthusiastic next step following the successful accomplishment of the first one, or a retreat after a saddening realization of the limits of that initial step, is a matter too complicated to determine, both with regards to Warner's own personal opinions and the contemporary feminist milieu at large. The notion of structural oppression is expressed, for example, in a monologue where Laura explains why the devil is a savior specifically of women. I can't take warlocks so seriously, not as a class. It is we witches who count. We have more need of you. Women have such vivid imaginations and lead such dull lives. Their pleasure in life is so soon over. They are so dependent upon others, and their dependence so soon becomes a nuisance. When I think of witches, I seem to see all over England, all over Europe, women living and growing old, as common as blackberries and as unregarded. Warner's positive view of Satan reflects her assessment of Christianity as a pivotal accomplice of patriarchal tyranny, a theme repeated throughout the narrative. Laura's sister-in-law Caroline, a religious and pedantic housewife, holds up Christ as the example for keeping her linens in perfect orderliness, saying, "The grave clothes were folded in the tomb." This scene belongs to a series of micro-level illustrations of the macro-analysis that the novel presents. Warner repeatedly lists the intertwined structures that tyrannize Laura and other women, identifying the church as a main culprit, and she derides church sermons as part of the patriarchal chains binding all women. Laura's rejection of the traditional role for a witch and her reconfiguration of herself as a self-defined version of the figure is related to the novel's overarching theme of forging an existence for oneself not in accordance with social scripts, but with one's own wishes. Repudiating the stereotypical Christian patriarchal view of Satan then fits in with this counter-discursive project. In the final scene of the novel, Laura gives Satan an apple, thus reversing the Garden of Eden story. This is a concrete indication of Warner's inversion of established notions, here specifically concerning the relationship between the devil and woman. More generally, her taking a figure usually embodying the ultimate evil and turning him into a benevolent entity should be read as part of a broader destabilizing revisionary project. Very effectively then, Warner constructs a feminist counter-myth and writes herself into a pre-existing pro-satanic tradition often intertwined with themes of women's liberation. Satanism was at the time a well-established language of symbolic resistance, which had influenced feminist discourse through romantics, socialists, theosophists, and other dissidents who employed Satan as a symbol of rebellion. By constructing subversive satanic counter-myths, women could undermine biblical myths, like Genesis 3, that had traditionally been weaponized by male chauvinists. The status these religious narratives held as the one truth was thus subverted, and the patriarchal order they underpinned attacked. Interestingly, Lolly Willowes was an immediate success with critics and sold extremely well. I have looked at 96 contemporary reviews and articles, and almost all of them consist of enthusiastic praise. Warner herself could all the same be irritated by the response of her readers, and in a letter to a friend, she explained that she felt, quote, as though I had tried to make a sword only to be told what a pretty pattern there was on the blade. What she had in mind here was that many seemed blind to the feminist theme of the novel. Not everyone was this uncomprehending, of course. The London-based suffrage magazine Woman's Leader underscored that one of the most significant elements in the text was that it was, quote, an essay on the woman question, end quote. One of the more spot-on descriptions of Satan's strategic role in this was provided by a reviewer for the Cape News, who wrote, why should Lolly's late-found independence be linked with Satan? Apparently because it means to her a charming, innocent idleness and a disregard of the conventional claims and routine duties of life. One rather suspects, at least, that the arch-rebel has been introduced because Miss Warner has been longing to impart to the world some interesting thoughts on women, and knows very well that an essay reaches only a select few, while thousands will devour eagerly this vivid tale. In other words, the reviewer understood Warner to be using a positive portrayal of Satan as a clever rhetorical device to make a point about the necessity of female independence. Less often acknowledged was the fact that the novel very explicitly highlights Christianity as a central part of the societal structures disempowering women. That Warner stood in a direct tradition of anti-Christian satanic feminism was, however, discerned by some. For example, the reviewer for the Birmingham Post, who drew direct parallels to Jules Michelet's La Sorcière. Perhaps as an expression of her wry sense of humor, Warner happily played up to interviewers' recurring speculations that she herself was perhaps a witch. She said similar things in private conversations. When Virginia Woolf asked her how she knew so much about witches, she replied, because I am one. In the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, the reviewer remarked that, quote, Miss Warner must clearly be a witch herself to describe Satan so well, end quote. This conflating of the author with her witch heroine was quite regular. It is to be found outside of actual reviews as well. The scrapbook of her publisher, Chatto & Windus, contains typewritten statements from American author Carl Van Vechten and British author David Garnett, presumably blurb and advertising material. The former praised, quote, the combination of Warner's curiously sure humor and an esoteric mystic paganism, end quote, while the latter stated that now, quote, for the first time the reader can understand the spiritual force which drove thousands of women into the witches' covens, end quote. Garnett further remarked that Warner herself, quote, is not, so far as I know, a witch, end quote, and predicted that the book will be well reviewed, as no one would willingly risk having a waxen image of himself held by Miss Townsend Warner in front of a slow fire. Warner herself certainly played a part in self-ironically blending her own public persona with that of the witch. In an interview with the Western Wales Gazette, published June 6, 1926, when the novel had already gone through several editions and was a huge success, she declared, quote, that her much-discussed book, Lolly Willowes, was meant seriously and that she believes in witches, end quote. The journalist then added, I'm not at all sure that she doesn't believe she's a witch herself. A brief notice in the Daily Mirror from July 13, 1926, states that Warner, quote, the author of a remarkable book, Lolly Willowes, now announces that she is a witch, end quote. Subsequently, on August 4 and 5, a direct statement of hers to this effect was reported in 2 other articles. A writer for the Newcastle Daily Journal divulged in June 1926 that he had engaged in, quote, numerous conversations with Miss Sylvia Townsend Warner lately on the subject of witchcraft. It is a fascinating subject and one in which she is widely versed. He then quotes Warner saying that witchcraft is still alive in England. Her final words in the brief piece proclaim about witchcraft that, quote, its powers can be applied to the most modern ways of life, in town or country. She is also quoted as saying, every modern woman who has a talent for real witchcraft should be a witch. By witchcraft, I mean the actual practice of witchcraft, for which there is an immense craving. I expect to see a great revival of it. This, of course, turned out to be quite prophetic, and it seems reasonable to suggest Lolly Willowes may have played a part in the revival in question. Thank you.
Fantastic, great. So we'll maybe bring our time. Oh no, do you want to sit on the couch?
We can sit on the couch.
Yeah.